Hello, and welcome to the third lesson in the iCow soil biology course. We're continuing with our discussion on soil bacteria. Let's remind ourselves where we were last week in lesson 2. We started by talking about the soil food web, the trophic levels, and how bacteria and fungi are categorized as being in the second trophic level. They're the decomposing mutualists, pathogens, parasites, and root feeders. We also spoke about the different shapes of bacteria and how we can identify beneficial bacteria from disease-causing bacteria by shape and also by movement. We learned that beneficial bacteria are generally not as motile as the disease-causing bacteria. We spoke about how beneficial bacteria suppress diseases, they build soil structure, they build soil microaggregates, retain nutrients in their bodies in the soils, and they retain water, they decompose toxins, and they maintain alkaline soil pH. And how most beneficial bacteria are aerobic, living in conditions where oxygen was above 6 micrograms per gram. And then we spoke about the disease-causing bacteria, which are mainly anaerobic, living in conditions with oxygen below 4 micrograms per gram, and how they cause disease, release toxins, and their lower pH causing acidity. And then we also mentioned the facultative bacteria, that group in the middle that exist in the zone between the aerobic and the anaerobic, in an area between 4 to 5 micrograms of oxygen per gram. And they have to work harder than others as they need to produce enzymes for both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. We also spoke about seeing facultative bacteria under a microscope and how that indicates to us that conditions are becoming anaerobic and what some of the drivers of the conditions might be. We spoke of soil compaction, water stagnation, and the suppression or removal of beneficial soil microbes by using the sides: bacterial side, pesticides, fungicides, insecticides. Our last session also focused on the beneficial bacteria, and we'll now look at the disease-causing bacteria, the wriggly ones with the funny shapes. The spirochetes, the spirillum, actinobacteria. The picture we're looking at was a sample taken from bioslurry, which is an anaerobic process that uses the anaerobic bacteria to decompose materials which in the process produce methane gas, which is used as an energy source. The picture is magnified at 400x, which is 400 times. And in this we can see the spirilla, which are the wiggly ones there, and the spirochetes, both pathogenic bacteria. In the next picture, we can see a chain of coccus called streptococcus. Again, these are disease-causing bacteria which grow and multiply in anaerobic conditions. And in this picture, we're looking at a sample also taken from bioslurry. We can see, again, some more spirilla, some vibrio. We can also see the lactobacillus, which are part of the fermentation bacteria, not necessarily bad bacteria in this case. So you can see that good and bacteria can exist in the same environment. But it's when we begin to see the bad bacteria that we know the situation is either becoming anaerobic or is anaerobic. The next slide is only magnified at 100x. It's a sample of soil where we can see beneficial bacteria, you can see those in the blue with a little arrow, as well as actinobacteria, which is a filamentous strand which also may look like a fungi, but actually it isn't. This is the only of the bacterial family that you could mistake, looking under a microscope, you could mistake these actually with fungi. But it is a bacteria, it's a single strand, it doesn't have the typical characteristics of a fungi, but it does suggest to us that the sample that we're looking at is low in oxygen. So if we see this in our soil, we know that our soils are either compact, have water stagnation, and are becoming anaerobic. Moving on, we know we have good and bad bacteria, and we know we need to encourage the beneficial bacteria in our soils as well as other soil amendments like composts and teas. Let's take a closer look at what bacteria eat. They're decomposers, and they use enzymes to enable them to consume simple foods more efficiently than other organisms. So when simple foods are present, bacteria have a feast. Bacteria need organic matter and sugar from plants, and if there are no plants, then they'll consume the organic matter and will only grow according to the organic matter availability. How can we ensure that bacteria have enough to eat? To begin with, you can supply them with organic matter, compost and mulch, etc. Or you can leave the soils covered with plants or cover crops to feed the bacteria. Bingo! Let the biology do the work for you, and the biology will take care of your crops. Moving on, how do bacteria reproduce? When bacteria accumulate enough nutrients and energy, the cell will undergo binary fission, that is, it splits into two separate cells. In perfect conditions, when the temperature, the moisture, and the food resources are perfectly balanced, bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes. And if conditions aren't perfect, bacterial growth will be slow. And in this case, if the conditions aren't appropriate at all, they may just hang out, they may go dormant, or they may even die. So what happens when conditions become unfavorable? Bacteria produce spores or dormant stages that can resist most environmental disturbances. They're quick to go into dormant stages, requiring 1 to several hours to recognize extreme conditions. They shut down metabolic activity and they form a spore. And spores can survive for several hundred years. Although some extreme fluctuations in conditions result in poorer survival rates. But they found bacteria and fungi in the pyramids in Egypt that have survived on some of the materials in there for thousands of years. So they're very adaptive to the conditions around. Who eats bacteria? So now we start talking about what their function is in the soil food web for the other microorganisms. So bacteria are the food for protozoa, bacterial feeding nematodes, earthworms, and possibly some microarthropods. Without them, the rest of the food web wouldn't work, the soil food web would not work. The more difficult to decompose parts of bacteria, say the cell walls and the membranes, some of those are beyond the ability of the predators to decompose, but they then get consumed by other bacteria and fungi. All ingested or digested or decomposed materials are eventually recycled back into their basic nutrients through the poop loop of life. And when we look at the left side there, living plants decompose into dead organic material. They get decomposed by the bacteria, the fungi, and in the process, nitrogen from those materials is accumulated in the body of those microorganisms. They then get chomped up by other soil predators, protozoa, amoeba, flagellate, ciliates. When they poop, they release those nutrients back into the soil in plant available forms, and so on and so forth as they themselves get eaten up that soil food web. In this slide, you can see that the trophic levels of the soil food web mirror the stages of succession of plant life above the soils. You may be wondering what exactly this means. This means that as soils become more balanced with all the soil microbes, with high diversity of soil microbes, it gets better at supporting higher succession plants. So that the higher succession plants go from the starting plants being weeds and finally right up to trees. Weeds can grow in really poor soils, and trees really can't. Trees really need very mature soils with very diverse and balanced soil food web. The reverse is true too, that as soils become eroded and compacted, They only support early trophic levels of the soil food web and support pioneer plants. And pioneer plants are those that jump in to try to save really bad soils. We've learned to call these weeds. So if your land is weedy, it's because of something that you're doing. Disturbing the soil pushes it back to supporting early succession plants. Looked at differently, when we till or plough the land and leave it bare, we mess the soil up really badly, and then weeds grow. Make sense? So for your homework in this lesson, think about the cover crops or plants that you can grow all year round to keep your soils permanently covered, feeding the soil microbes. Consider that they must be shorter than your cash crop so that they don't compete for sunlight. And remember, they're not competing for nutrients. They are in fact providing nutrients to your soil microbes, and they're building your soil health. So that's all for today's session, and we shall be moving on to our fourth lesson, which will be about the fungi. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.